This business did not fail because the directors did anything wrong. It was because one customer withheld payment and it wiped them out overnight. It was a groundworks company who had done everything by the book, yet one terminated contract, one unpaid invoice, and it pushed them into a mountain of debt. And if they didn't take the right steps fast, these directors faced the real possibility of losing everything personally. But here's the truth no one sees. These directors fought hard. They tried everything. They negotiated. They chased the customer. They cut costs. They even took a load of personally guaranteed debt to save the business. Then they explored a pre-pack. They did everything that responsible, hard-working people do when they're trying to save a business that they've spent years building. But guess what? The numbers just wouldn't stack. So I want you to watch this breakdown of a job to the end, because if you're a company who's relying on one big customer paying on time, this story could easily be yours. And you need to know how to protect yourself before it's too late. So let's get into a little bit of background. What actually happened? So, couple of lads, really decent, hard-working folk. They were ground workers for years, and they eventually got the chance to sort of do their own business. And they were given an opportunity with a number of small contracts, and they set up their own company. Now, these guys were really good. They were really hard-working. What that actually did, it caught the eye of a really big firm. And they went to work for this big firm, and all was well for a few years. And then out of nowhere, the contract suddenly got terminated without warning. Without going into too much detail, what had happened is there'd been an issue on one of their jobs with a subcontractor that this firm used. But the main contractor come in and said, no, because of that, we are terminating your contract. And they refused to pay a very large outstanding invoice. So overnight, cash flow had collapsed. And the company couldn't cover the next month's running costs. They were in absolute panic. So when they come to us, obviously the first question we say is, right, what's going on? And we went through it. They owed hire companies, they owed subcontractors, they owed some utility companies, they owed big money to the HMRC. I think HMRC was at about £100,000. Now, what had happened was, a few months previous, there had been, again, some slowdown in their payments from this firm, and they took on a £200,000 personally guaranteed loan, okay? In addition to that, 2 years ago, they took another PG'd loan that was now down to £80,000. So they had over £500,000 worth of debt, and in addition to that, two very large personal guarantees. So the first step is like, what can we do here? Can we save this business? Can we actually go in? Can we negotiate with HMRC? Can we speak to suppliers, get more breathing space? What does the next sort of 3, 6, 9 months work? Now, the problem was there was smaller bits of work, but these guys were so heavily reliant on that big job. There was no way we were going to be able to go and negotiate with creditors and HMRC because they didn't know where the next penny was coming from, okay? So the business couldn't really be saved. You know, we had a look at what the work pipeline was, and it was minimal. Now, there was no additional contracts, there's no pipeline of work, there was a little bit of money that was owed in. So the next step is, okay, well, the business can't be saved. Could it be saved through an insolvency process like administration? Now, administration is where you appoint an administrator, there is a wall of protection around your business, while the administrator generally looks to sell it back to the directors. It's called a pre-pack administration. You have to market the business so everybody gets an opportunity to potentially buy your business. But the chances are when you're an owner-operated business, the business doesn't have a great deal of value to anyone else, but it did have a value to these guys. And we looked at this and thought, right, well, can we put it into administration and can we sell this business out of admin and save the jobs? Because there are about 25 staff as well. Now, the problem was because there was no active contracts, that there was no guaranteed revenue, there was no real assets of any value bar a couple of vans, a pre-pack admin just wouldn't work. It wasn't viable because they were going to bring these lads that work with them, transfer them all over to a new company to have no work. So an administration wasn't suitable, this scenario. So finally we looked at, right, well, what is it that these guys are hoping to achieve here? And the reality is that they wanted to limit the damage, because the business, it had been wiped out overnight. And although these lads want to be ground workers again on a much smaller scale, and they want to buy the vans back potentially, it was decided that they do a voluntary liquidation. And that is really a full stop on this business. Obviously, there was no ability to trade out, there was no new work coming in, there was no rescue from a buyer, and obviously HMRC and other creditors, the pressure was starting to rise. So what a CVL did, they signed their documents. 21 days later, there was something called a creditors meeting. And once they'd signed the documents, they rang their creditors, and we spoke to some of their creditors to tell them what was going on. And this stopped creditor pressure almost immediately. Okay. Now, once they signed their documents and they stopped trading, obviously it prevented the risk of anyone accusing them of trading insolvently or trading wrongfully. And it gave the directors some clarity of what was going to happen next. And it created a very orderly shutdown rather than a messy collapse. So there was some assets in the business, but they were a number of vehicles, okay? There was very little plant and machinery, and what happened is an independent agent went in there and they valued the assets. And what they did in the report, they put, there was a in situ figure and an ex situ figure. And that in situ figure is what the agent believed the assets were worth to the directors. And the ex situ figure is what he believed it would be worth at auction. And some of the pieces got took to public auction to be sold to return to creditors. And one of the vehicles was bought by the director for a fair market value, and he was able to pay it over 3 months. Now, anything that gets raised from an auction or when you're buying assets back from an insolvency practitioner, those money goes into the liquidation estate, and the idea is to give something back to creditors. And what it does when you're looking at selling assets, okay, getting an independent agent involved, it ensures things is transparent, fair and legally compliant. Now, the big problem for these guys, okay, and this was the bit that they thought, right, we're going to end up being made personally bankrupt, was the personal guarantees. So what we did is we introduced them to a colleague of ours who was called Gary Whitehead. You'll be able to see a video, a podcast that I've done with Gary on PGs. And Gary managed to speak to both of these creditors. And essentially what had happened was, the creditors obviously want the money back in an insolvency scenario, but most creditors don't want to be going through with bankruptcies, because in this scenario, these chaps, if they'd have been made bankrupt, there would have been nothing going back to these personal guarantee companies, because they both had properties, okay, but the equitable positions in these properties were fairly low. So I think one guy had 25% equity and the other was in something called a help to buy. So there was no equity whatsoever. And people don't understand that bankruptcy is really expensive. So people out there are thinking, oh crikey, I've signed personal guarantees, the chances are I'm going to be made bankrupt. Well, now what happened with these guys is they've both been able to do deals with those loan companies over extended periods, and for the first 12 months what they've done is they've gone on real minimum payments, literally a few £100 a month. It will be reviewed in 6 months to see if things get better, and the idea is in their new company, because remember they've started again just on a much smaller scale, eventually they'll be making some profit to pay some of these PGs down, okay? The key thing is, if you've got problems with PGs, you've got to pick the phone up. In fact, this is probably a good part of the video is, if anything I've said now is sort of struck a chord, click that link in the comment section. One of my team will call you today. Free, independent, no strings, no obligation. And by dealing with these PGs, both directors' homes were protected. Not to mention that the mental health. I mean, this was the thing where they could not sleep at night, thought they were going to end up homeless. So what the liquidation actually achieved is, obviously, the directors realised overnight the business was over. They took immediate action, okay? So nobody can accuse them of wrongful trading insolvently. There was no personal liability for the creditors. In fact, when they spoke to the creditors, a lot of the creditors were aware of what gone on, and they were insured against the debt. And those that weren't, they were so surprised at how they were almost sympathetic to the lads as to what had happened. In addition, that HMRC arrears, that got wiped out in the liquidation. And obviously the personal guarantees were handled sensibly, and sustainable repayment plans have been agreed. Now the directors today, they're free to rebuild their life and their careers. Like the stress, I'm not going to say it's gone completely, because they've still got to deal with these PGs. But the constant fear and sleepless night has stopped. So most directors who I speak to, they're not here because they're bad people. It's the business is becoming insolvent, you know. Could be one job that's not been paid, a contract that's cancelled, client going silent, costs rising, suddenly you're drowning. But what I want to tell you is that there's a legal and safe way out. And if you're staring at numbers like this, suppliers, HMRC, PG loans, you don't know how you're going to make payroll, I want you to pick the phone up, because the longer you leave it, the fewer options you have. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, what I want you to do, I want you to go there and I want you to watch this video, and it's going to tell you everything you must do before you liquidate a business. It's going to get you into an expert status in one video. Thanks for your time, Chris Worden.